So, look at this. It's a pagoda, obviously, a monument to theme park Orientalism that stood at the Dreamland amusement park in Coney Island in 1904. But wait. What is that? Airship? There's an airship in there. Well, obviously, I had to find out more. Why was there an airship in a pagoda in Coney Island in 1904? And like literally everything else, I wind up researching about early Coney Island. It is a rabbit hole into a segment of history that I've never really thought much about before, and a story by turns triumphant and tragic that somehow also involves the popularization of the wristwatch. So let's call this episode, Why Was There an Airship in a Coney Island Pagoda? So inside this pagoda is the Santos-Dumont No. 9, the smallest airship invented and built by legendary Brazilian aviator Alberto Santos-Dumont, which he would fly around Paris, even using it to commute to local cafes and such. He would just fly this thing between the buildings and then gently land it on the street. And that is so friggin' cool. Why did this personal airship never become a popular commuter vehicle? Like, why can't I order one off of Wish right now? Anyway, let's back up. Who was Alberto Santos-Dumont, and why was he blimping his way through the air lanes of Paris? Oh, and did he actually invent the first airplane rather than those poser Americans, the Wright brothers? That's the clickbait part, and the answer is probably not, although he certainly believed that he had, and there is a pretty interesting controversy there. Alberto Santos-Dumont was born in Brazil in 1873, one of 8 children of Henrique Dumont and Francisca de Paula Santos. His father was a coffee magnate who used his knowledge of engineering to transform his plantation into a cutting-edge agricultural powerhouse of over 5 million coffee trees, and himself into one of the richest men in South America. So no, this is not a rags to riches story. It's actually more of a riches to probably slightly fewer riches story. Alberto Santos-Dumont was raised in an atmosphere of wealth and privilege. Like his father, he had an interest and aptitude for engineering and quickly learned to operate and repair the steam-powered traction engines that the farm used for hauling coffee berries. He was a sensitive dreamer, and he avoided horseplay and declined to accompany his father and brothers on hunting expeditions. Instead, he preferred to read Jules Verne. And Verne's descriptions of fantastical flying machines inspired in the 10-year-old boy a sudden passion for aeronautics. He built small models of hot air balloons that lifted aloft from the stovetop, filled bags with buoyant gas, and created rubber band-powered propellers to fly gliders throughout the household. When Alberto was 18, his father was thrown from a horse and suffered paralysis to half his body. This accident upended all of their lives, and soon Alberto's father had sold the plantation and arranged for his family to travel to Paris, where Henrique was from, to seek out medical treatment. And that was where Alberto's passion for aeronautics became an obsession. In Paris, Alberto found a city that was at the forefront of many technologies, from the brand new Eiffel Tower to some of the very first automobiles. The young engineer was delighted and soon availed himself of an electric buggy for tooling around the city. Although he had a great deal of potential, his temperament did not agree with university. He simply couldn't handle doing the routine rote work of formal education, so when his father died in 1892, Alberto came into his inheritance and immediately hired a college professor to provide him with private lessons in the sciences. Apparently, when he'd arrived in Paris, he was disappointed that it wasn't a Jules Verne-esque technocracy where everyone had their own personal airships. And who wouldn't be disappointed in that? Not only that, he had grown to believe that the use of aircraft would further the causes of world peace, since it would allow people to more easily travel to other nations and learn more about their ways, leading to greater understanding and less hostility between them. So he made it his business to correct both of these problems. After riding in a balloon for the first time, he set about designing one for his own use. In contrast with the other gas balloons of the day, which weighed hundreds and hundreds of pounds, His envelope, basket, and all would weigh only 17. The balloon manufacturers he hired to work on it with him were horrified. How could such a flimsy craft survive in the unpredictable wind? Alberto, though, was determined. And when his craft was ready, he doubled down on his belief in the balloon's capabilities by insisting on taking it aloft during a storm. "I would listen to nothing," he wrote later, "but soon I had cause to regret my rashness. I was alone, lost in the clouds amid flashes of lightning and claps of thunder in the rapidly approaching darkness of night." But the balloon held steady, and it wasn't long before his initial fear was replaced by joy. In the black void, one seems to float without weight, without a surrounding world, a soul freed from the weight of matter. He was hooked, and having been vindicated in his radical design of a tiny balloon, he set his sights on another goal, making it steerable. He designed another balloon envelope, this time in the elongated shape of a cigar, theorizing that that would allow him to cut through the wind, and he began tinkering with small petroleum engines, eventually combining 2 tricycle motors and attaching an aluminum propeller and silk rudder. It worked. The Santos-Dumont Airship No. 1 was the world's first engine-powered and steerable airship. And Alberto himself attracted Parisian press, but he still wasn't satisfied. He now turned himself into an airship designing machine. The Airship No. 2 had a wider balloon and a more efficient air pump to help the envelope keep its shape. But due to his decision to take it up, once again in a thunderstorm, he crashed it into a nearby stand of trees. For the No. 3, he redesigned the envelope from a cigar shape to something more like an American football, and it steered beautifully. He built the No. 4 for speed and removed the traditional basket. Instead, the pilot would sit on a converted bicycle frame that also supported the motor and propeller. He used the bicycle's handlebars to control the rudder, and its pedals to start the 7-horsepower engine. The balloon itself was 95 feet long and 17 feet wide, and was described as looking like a huge yellow caterpillar. Not exactly small enough for a personal aircraft, but it did fly. In 1900, French oilman Henri Deutsch de la Morte established a 100,000 franc prize for the first aeronaut who could fly his craft around the Eiffel Tower in 30 minutes or less and then land safely back at the starting point. Alberto began working on his 5th airship in response, this time creating a keel that would allow for greater maneuverability. Using it, he was able to circumnavigate the tower, but unfortunately he crashed into the Seine, destroying the ship. He emerged from it unhurt, and now No. 6 was on the drawing board. On October 19, 1901, he was ready to try for the prize again. At 2:42 p.m., with only a crowd of a dozen or so spectators, he set off, reached the tower in record time, and then easily circled its lightning rod at a distance of no more than 40 feet. The Parisians below had taken notice, and now thousands of them ran to his takeoff point, ready to greet him when he finally landed. Suddenly, the easy wind that had helped him reach the tower so quickly turned on him, and worse, his engines stalled. Working quickly, he turned in his seat and struggled to fix the recalcitrant engine, losing time as the balloon drifted off course. But after a few minutes of frantic repair, the engines sputtered back to life, and he resumed his flight. Soon he had returned to the landing field, where 5,000 spectators now cheered for him. Paul Hoffman describes the scene in his book on Santos-Dumont, Wings of Madness. When his basket was low enough for his voice to be heard over the applause, he leaned over the side and yelled, "Have I won the prize?" Hundreds of spectators responded in unison, "Yes, yes," and swarmed the airship. He was showered with flower petals that swirled like confetti. Men and women cried. The Comtesse de O dropped to her knees, raised her hands to the heavens, and thanked God for protecting her fellow countrymen. The Countess's companion, the wife of John D. Rockefeller, squealed like a schoolgirl. A stranger presented Santos-Dumont with a small white rabbit, and another handed him a steaming cup of Brazilian coffee. An astounding scene. For God's sakes, the man was awarded a white rabbit. And was this a thing in 1900s Paris, giving people white rabbits for their accomplishments? Or did this guy just happen to have a white rabbit with him and figured he'd better give Santos-Dumont something? The world may never know. At any rate, with so much excitement, it is not a surprise that a near riot broke out when the official timekeeper for the event announced that although Dumont had returned to the starting point within the 30-minute time limit, he had not landed the craft until 30 minutes and 40 seconds. It was a scandal that rocked Paris, and the Aero Club judges were besieged by angry French aeronautics fans. Santos-Dumont became, in the words of one newspaper reporter, the god of Paris, cheered wherever he went. Women's hats now sported a Santos-Dumont veil with velvet appliqué, which had the shape of Santos-Dumont's dirigible balloons. Toy airships flooded the shops, and bakers produced gingerbread cookies in his likeness. In other words, nobody cared about that extra 40 seconds except for the Aero Club. On November 4th, the Aero Club relented to the zeitgeist and awarded Santos-Dumont the 100,000 francs, which he then promptly distributed among his workers and the city's poor. Now the news went far and wide, and he became a hero not just to the people of Brazil and France, but to the world. But again, he wasn't content, and he returned to his workshop. Airship number 7 was 3 times more powerful than number 6, and he skipped number 8 because of a superstition against the number 8, which is a thing in France, I guess. And now we come to number 9, the airship that was housed in the Coney Island pagoda. Having refined both speed and maneuverability in his crafts, he turned his attention to making the number 9 smaller, the personal aircraft he had always dreamed of, something like a flying car. Its envelope was 1/3 the size of the number 6's, and soon he was puttering through the streets of Paris at an altitude of about 60 feet, landing the craft at cafes and restaurants, running errands and shopping, just as though he were driving an automobile. One observer described his experience when Alberto dropped in on a cafe that he was dining at. "I had just sat down on the terrace of a cafe and was enjoying an iced orangeade. All of a sudden, I was shaken with surprise on seeing an airship come down right in front of me. The guide rope coiled around the legs of my chair. The airship was just above my knees, and Mr. Santos-Dumont got out. Whole crowds of people rushed forward and widely acclaimed the great Brazilian aviator. Mr. Santos-Dumont asked me to excuse him for having startled me. He then called for a drink, got on board of his airship again, and went gliding off into space. He used the number 9 almost like a sort of public relations vehicle. He took children for rides in it and even allowed a young woman to fly the craft alone for a mile-long trip, which made her, Aida de Acosta, the very first ever female aircraft pilot. There was speculation that the two may have been romantically linked, but, well, the always impeccably dressed Santos-Dumont didn't seem very interested in women. Instead, he preferred the company of lifelong bachelors, like the illustrator Sem. In fact, those two dressed alike and spent almost all of their time together over the course of a year. Just two really, really, really good friends. Really good friends.
And they were very, very friendly men.
Good friends. Oh, here's one unexpected way that this odd aeronaut may have affected your life. Because his new mode of travel did not permit him to easily check his pocket watch, he requested the jeweler Maison Cartier design him a wristwatch. At the time, wristwatches were primarily considered women's accessories because, no pockets. But the sight of one on Alberto's arm caused them to be popularized for men as well. In fact, Maison Cartier still sells a watch line named Santos in honor of the Brazilian. I was thinking it would be really cool to own one of those one day. Hold on. I will never own a Santos watch. After he grew tired of floating through the Parisian streets in the number 9, he took it to New York, where it went on display in the Dreamland Pagoda on Coney Island. According to early advertising materials, the plan had been for the craft to make daily flights, although it is not clear that that ever happened, and you have to wonder whether the difference between the quiet streets of Paris and the breezy coast of Coney Island may have played a role in that. But at the very least, curious visitors could view the airship while they waited for the next showing of the cyclorama's creation or fighting the flames or what have you. Having conquered the airship to his satisfaction, Alberto now turned his attention to the latest frontier of aeronautics, heavier-than-air flight. Having observed the lifting power of box kites when he was a child, he decided to, well, basically make an airplane out of box kites and powered by, again, an automobile engine. And it worked. On August 23rd, 1906, the airship number 14 managed to lift off the ground under its own power and travel, well, not very far. It just kind of hopped, as a matter of fact. But still, it did get 6 inches off the ground and become the very first heavier-than aircraft to actually fly. Okay, I know. You're like, what about the Wright brothers? And okay, yes, obviously they flew first, but their 1903 flight at Kitty Hawk was surprisingly controversial at the time, mainly because the two bicycle makers were extremely secretive about their tests. In fact, in 1906, Scientific American was openly questioning whether the Kitty Hawk flight had ever taken place, and other publications asked whether the Wright brothers were flyers or liars. Boom! Roasted! But in contrast to the Wright brothers, Alberto Santos-Dumont had demonstrated heavier-than-air flight in public. Within a few weeks of tinkering, his airplane was now flying 10 feet above the ground for hundreds of feet. And for approximately a year, many members of the public and the aero clubs believed that he had, in fact, achieved heavier-than-air flight first, and that the Wright brothers were just the latest in a long line of Yankee hucksters. It wasn't until 1907 that the Wright brothers finally made public demonstrations that convinced the world that their plane really could fly and that the Kitty Hawk flight really had happened back in 1903, and soon their fame began to eclipse Alberto's. Alberto continued to design aircraft until 1910, but in that year he had an unfortunate accident in his latest craft, the Demoiselle, and in the course of his recovery, he became ill. While treating him, his doctor made a serious discovery. Alberto Santos-Dumont had multiple sclerosis, which was causing vertigo and double vision, and may have led to that crash. Because of this disease, he would no longer be able to pilot aircraft safely. As you can imagine, this was devastating to the man who had devoted his life to flying, and after dismissing his workmen and shuttering his workshop, he fell into a deep depression. He moved out of Paris and only rarely made public appearances. And then the war happened. The Great War. Alberto Santos-Dumont had always been an idealist when it came to his inventions. He truly believed that airplanes and flight in general would serve to bring the world closer to peace. After all, airships and planes would allow for more travel. People in one country could easily more visit people in another and gain greater understanding of the people who lived there, and with greater understanding would come greater acceptance, tolerance, and camaraderie. Right? Right? But the year 1914 quickly disabused him of that notion. Airplanes, now capable of sustained flight at high altitudes, had become an intrinsic part of military strategy. At first, they were mainly used for reconnaissance, but then, you know. He was horrified. Airships and airplanes, the inventions that he believed would help bring about world peace, were now being used as an essential component in the devastating carnage of World War I. Dogfights between plane pilots dominated the newspapers, who often glorified the battles between them. And airships, his own special creation of the early 20th century, dropped thousands of bombs over the battlefields. Not only were the reports of carnage disheartening to him, he even began to feel responsible for the death and destruction that came from the sky. As Paul Hoffman states in Wings of Madness, he held himself personally responsible for every fatality caused by a flying machine, and to punish himself he read as much as he could about the gory details of the deaths. He now believes that he is more infamous than the devil, wrote an acquaintance, Martin Dugard. A feeling of repentance invades him and leaves him in a flood of tears. After the war, and as the tremors from MS took hold, Alberto became even more reclusive, rarely receiving visitors. He traveled between several homes in Europe and Brazil and spent his days raising orchids and writing letters to heads of state, asking them to cease their military use of aircraft. They declined. His depression seemed to worsen, and when he stopped eating, his relatives stepped in to have him institutionalized in Europe. And throughout the 1920s, he was in and out of various asylums. His psychological issues during this time are not well understood, but it seems that there may have been more worrisome problems than just depression. At one point, he attempted to jump out of a sanitarium window after having glued feathers to his arms, apparently believing that he would be able to fly. A nurse prevented him from going through with it. In 1928, he was encouraged to leave the Swiss institution at which he had had an extended stay, and one of his nephews traveled from Brazil to accompany him back to his homeland. But as his ship sailed into the Bay of Rio, a tragedy occurred. A group of a dozen Brazilian scientists had boarded an airplane to greet him, and as he neared the coast, they planned to drop balloons and confetti in celebration of the hero's return. But as the plane approached, something went wrong, and it exploded in the air, even as Alberto was waving to it. All 12 men aboard were killed. After this horrific event, Alberto returned to Europe and the sanitariums where he spent his time trying, in vain, to design mechanical wings that a person could wear strapped to their backs. In 1931, he returned to Brazil for the final time. The country was in the throes of a revolution, and although his nephew set him up at a beachside hotel to ensure his tranquility, the fighting soon came too close for him to ignore. On July 23, 1932, an airplane bombed a target near his hotel. This was the final straw for him, and after sending his nephew away on a false errand, he hanged himself in his bathroom. He was 59 years old. The revolution lasted another 6 months, and when it was finally over, he was given a proper funeral. At the very moment pallbearers lowered his body into the grave, thousands of pilots around the world tipped the wings of their planes in a final gesture of respect. But not all of Santos-Dumont was buried. The doctor who embalmed the body secretly removed the heart, and later donated it to the Brazilian government on the condition that it be displayed publicly. In fact, it can still be seen today in a museum in the Air Force Academy at Campos de Alfonsos, preserved in formaldehyde and kept inside a gold-plated globe held aloft by a winged man. Thank you for watching. I do have a Patreon at patreon.com/TyBannerman. In any support, even joining for free, is much appreciated. I post updates there, as well as early access to videos for the paying tiers. And, as always, thank you for meeting me